sit here. B.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's call this meeting to order, as they said in formal occasions. My name is Paolo von Schirach, and I am the president of the Global Policy Institute, and I also serve as a professor of political science and international. And other places, so everybody's welcome, new friends and old friends. And we're here to talk about, obviously, an extremely important subject, probably one of the most important crises in global security that I can think of. I'm sure others may add other possibilities, but certainly Ukraine is really a big problem for Ukraine, for Europe, for the United States, for Western solidarity and global security. And we're fortunate today to have with us to discuss this complicated issue, Katerina, who is originally from Ukraine, but residing now in the Washington area. She has quite a bit of experience, a very sophisticated and complex experience in politics and campaigns and elections, and in Ukraine and beyond, in the region, whether it's Kazakhstan, I believe, and other places as well. But now she is, working from the U.S., but clearly with Ukraine as her primary objective. And then we've got Stephen here with us, Stephen Blank, who has a distinguished career in international security and defense analysis and military affairs. And so I think with the combined resources of political side and military security, strategic side, maybe we can shed some light on current events. For those, I'm sure many of you are aware of what's going on right now. What's going right now is that, believe it or not, we could talk about historic moments. Everything that happens is in the headlines is historic, but this may very well be historic. We are now potentially at an inflection point in which the United States may, I hope not, fail to follow through on its pledges to continue its very significant support militarily to Ukraine in terms of funds and munitions and materials and hardware, everything that Ukraine desperately needs to continue its war efforts against the Russian invaders, because of domestic squabbles. We've got our own domestic problems, unfortunately, deep disagreements between Republicans and Democrats about national priorities, and the effort to link continuing aid to Ukraine and also Israel, which is not something we're going to talk about today, to other issues, which admittedly are important, which is the safety and the security of the southern border of the United States, which is a huge mess. There is people may agree or disagree whether linking these two different subjects, security and international security, and if you wish, domestic security, which is safety, defending our borders, whether these two really belong together. But this is where we are right now. The Democratic Party, starting with obviously the president, doesn't want to do this, and the Republicans, who many of you will know control one of the branches of our legislature, the House, don't want to decouple. And we're at the end of the year. The Congress is about to adjourn, and we may very well close the year with a question mark on continuing American reliable support and robust support to Ukraine. Should this effort fail, it will be, in my opinion, a disaster. But I would like our guests to tell us what they think. So why don't I start with you, Stephen, and give us your take as to where we are, what's the situation on the ground, what are the implications of this potentially failed vote by the Congress to appropriate the money to continue the delivery of weapons? How do you see all this thing?
Well, let me put it starkly, since you outlined the problem, both for the audience here and people who are participating virtually. If the United States does not follow through on aid to Ukraine, or continues, and you should note that verb, continues to give Ukraine not enough of money or weapons that it needs, then Ukraine loses the war. There will be a new Cold War in Europe as well as globally, and we will have to spend much more money on defense than is currently the case, and we will be threatened with an outbreak of crises, if not wars, all over the globe. I would submit to you, I'll try to do this quickly, that many of the crises we see today are in part influenced by the fact that dictators perceive the United States and the West as decadent, weak-willed, corrupt even, and unwilling to support their own allies. The terrorist attack by Hamas on October 7th, I think, is linked to an Iranian Hamas perception of this, as well as of Russian support. The new crisis that Venezuela is trying to set up, whereby it now is trying to annex part of Guyana, is another example, I think, of where they think that they can get away with something because Western attention is distracted, and the West, in any case, doesn't have the stomach for a protracted crisis. Chinese and movements on the Philippines, which have been taking place for the last month or so, I think are another example, plus nuclear proliferation. I did a program yesterday about where we see Russia and to some degree China proliferate or abetting nuclear proliferation in the Middle East and in East Asia. All these crises are going to continue, and as soon as the Russian economy recovers, they will be in position to launch more military adventures. They're already trying in Moldova, Serbia. Recently, apparently, Putin has castigated Latvia, so we can see where this is happening. Another example for Putin is the movement of nuclear weapons into Belarus, which is a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, clearly threatening Central Europe with nuclear weapons as well as Ukraine. And this is not going to stop. So the stakes are essentially, is there international security? Is there an international order? Or are we simply returning to the law of the jungle?
Well, thank you for this framing the issue for us, Katarina. To you now, tell us, obviously, since you know your country well and you know the players. Zelensky was just here, right? Literally, he was staying next door, the Hay Adams, I believe, when he was here a few days ago, trying to make his case in Congress, and apparently with no great success, pushing, obviously, for a resolution of this impasse. But tell us how you view the politics of all this and looking at it at this American confusion, or I'm just being polite here, from Kiev. How does it look? And if something bad happens, or meaning it doesn't happen, that is, American aid is not forthcoming, how is Ukraine going to deal with all this?
Yeah, thank you, Paolo, first of all, for this initiative, and to your university. You do a lot of progressive things, and we're very delightful to open, I hope, Cyrus, of these programs about foreign policy. So to answer your question, first of all, look, situation, it's hard, and even all people on the Hill said that now, unfortunately, we haven't direct solution how to defeat Russia in this war. And for answering second question, like what is the next, I want to show you some numbers. I think for people who firstly, maybe like listen about Ukraine, this presentation will be useful. It's a presentation for 5 slides, but it's contain basic numbers of situation for now. So if we talk about like that it's no solution, we must understand what number we're talking about. So, and on the first year of war, we have 300 billions of losses in Ukraine. I mean, 300 billions, it was only by one war, losses for private business, for households, for infrastructure. And for now, Kiev School of Economics counts that it's around $600 billion. So one
So
more
these are
time,
the economic losses,
economic losses. Yeah. So you can understand
the cost of the war.
It's minimum cost of the war, and it's not continue, for example, situations that we haven't economy grow and business loses. So it's only direct losses which we have for Ukrainian economy and for Ukrainian infrastructure. You can imagine what impact we have only after bombing of dam in my native Kherson region. So it's give to world one more ecological catastrophe, and obviously it's billions of dollars to damage to region and damage to economical pathway for agriculture products, because a lot of wheat was also transported through this dam. It's only one example. I also must remind you that Russian frozen assets in the United States only 300 billions for now. And even if we talk about like compensations and rebuilding, Russian assets in the United States not enough. Second part, which important, and second point, which important to remember, it's the next slide, that war still going on in southern Ukraine, bombing and shelling. It's situation for every day, and if we haven't spin of attention to this question in American media, because no, you know, all Western people have very low time of spin of attention to some war, and now obviously mostly people pay attention to war between Israel and Hamas and situation in Israel. But still, I must remind you that, and I know it directly because I'm originally from southern Ukraine. My father was governor of Kherson region. It's the next region to Crimea. Shelling and bombing every day, and obviously it's violation of Geneva Convention because it's bombing of fully civil infrastructure. I mean, hospitals, schools, etc. So we must remember also this point. Next point, it's point and answer to some Republicans' position about we will give weapons to Ukraine, but we will not give support to Ukrainian budget. So why it's no, you know, not good message for American society? Because as you see, a lot of Ukrainians who are refugees, and it's around 8 million people, now they thinking to stay in Europe. It's mostly Eastern Europe, or in places where they settled. And more years they settled in this country, they understand language, kids go to school. So the most active economically active population go to Europe or to other countries, settle there, and Ukraine lose a lot of people who can originally create additional income for country and income for economy. So, and the next slides also explain why it's happened. So one more time, Kiev School of Economics, which have a lot of international grants for this research, also show to you level of depression, anxiety, and stress in Ukrainian society. And also they compare this level of stress, which is pretty high. And you see sometimes it's extremely high and mostly for women who also in charge for kids. And this level of stress 2 times more than level of stress for people in Taiwan, who also now live in stress factors. And so it's one more issue which important to understand. Other issue, it's why we still stand against, we as Ukrainian nation still against Russia, because no, you know, Russia still have a lot of Soviet Union weapons, and also they not count people. So you see that Prigozhin and his private army directly took people from prisons, and also people with low income communities. I mean, low income communities in Russia, it's really low income. It's $100 a month. So, and when they get opportunity to go to army and have like $2,000 a month, they go to army. So, but still, against this huge number of marginalized people and Soviet Union weapons, mostly Ukrainians still believe in Ukrainian army, and they still believe in victory. So mostly people believe in full victory of Ukraine, and it gives additional motivation, and even additional motivation now when European support and American support on their quite stressful. The next slide, and it will be the last slide, it's also a point of growth. So it's on Ukrainian, I will translate for you, that still oil and gas industry, now 146 company very active. Also food industry, 128 companies active and grow. And agriculture sector, also 102 companies, it grow for now. So still in war period, Ukrainian economy, it's have some points for growth, and it's and I am one more time want to give message here in DC that Ukrainians want to work Republicans and Democrats. We understand that we need to present our direct plan, and we need to rebuild the Ukrainian economy also, and get more opportunities from this money which go to war economy, which Russia originally did. And second part, that we're ready to work for bipartisan support, and we as society understand that it can be long war. So I hope that these points from losers of Ukraine, and also some sociological polls and understanding of key economy sector, give to you understanding what happens now, and why Ukrainian security is so important to show all authoritarian regimes, I mean to Iran, to partly to China Communist Party, that democratic way of thinking and way of international hegemony more important and more powerful than scenario which Putin proposed to us. And thank you one more time for attention.
Thank you for the comprehensive, and thank you for the slides that hopefully illustrate your points to everybody, including those who may just be general, not totally acquainted with all the details. Stephen, back to you again at this point. Since we are dealing with kind of an emergency situation right now, passing or not passing this package, but in a broader sense, how do you as a military expert evaluate the way in which everybody, America of course being the primary supplier, but also the Europeans, of course we said, oh, we were going to aid Ukraine, at least until recently, whatever it takes, for as long as it takes. And yet when it came to critical decisions about supplying important weapon systems, it was, oh, well, maybe later, maybe not now. They asked, for fighter jets from day one, because the Ukrainian Air Force is, small and outnumbered and with old weapons and all that stuff. Long-range missiles. No, because with long-range missiles, then you're going to shoot into Russia. We don't want you to do that. And so this has been kind of the what we've seen, the kabuki dance of give me this. Oh, not now. Oh, we'll give it to you. How many tanks can we get? Oh, you get 20 tanks. You don't win a war with 20 tanks or 30 tanks. There's no way. In other words, based on your expertise, is this the way to fight a war? Clausewitz said famously, the purpose of war is the complete and total annihilation of your enemy forces. You want to wipe them away and destroy every single thing that they have. That's what war is about. Is the American or the Biden administration version of the war will give you enough to hold your line, but not enough to win? Is this really ultimately what it is? Because we haven't seen even before this current problem, which now has overtaken everything. that the way in which we provided help, which is very substantial, was significant, but never enough to give Ukraine the offensive force that they would really need to break through what are now, deeply entrenched Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. What's your take on this?
Well, you stated some of the points I'm going to make. From the beginning, as far as anybody can discern, the US policy and perhaps policy of some major European states, because there's no such thing as Europe, politically speaking. And this is not new. This is what Bismarck said 125 years ago in his memoirs. Anti-Europe, notion géographique, for those of you who speak French. It's purely a geographical notion. Russia should lose, but Ukraine should not win. That appears to have been American policy. Now, on Tuesday, President Biden said Ukraine should win. Does that mean a change in policy? We'll see. No one knows yet. It's too early to tell. But the fact of the matter is that the aid given to Ukraine has been too little, too late, and once again shows that Europe is not ready for prime time. There's no such thing as Europe. The European states have all kinds of excuses. Prime Minister Scholz in Germany gets up and says this Zeitenwende, change in time. It's a marker of change. But yet he refuses to give the Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Other countries have their own excuses. It's also that Europeans have the most inefficient defense industry you can imagine. We don't have time to get into that, but I have read in the last 30 years an ocean of literature on the defects of European defense industry, and it doesn't appear that much has been done to correct it. And that there is no European defense institution. There is NATO, which is Atlantic. So it's Europe and the United States and Canada. So our policy has been apparently Ukraine should not lose, but it should not win. Now, maybe that's changing. But in the event, we still haven't given them enough. What we've given them has been crucial, but it's still not enough for victory. Europe has given an awful lot of money to sustain the Ukrainian budget. The Ukrainian budget needs somewhere between $5 and $7 billion a month simply to survive. We're not talking about, this is no frills. You like that term.
Pay the salaries.
Pay salaries, keep the lights on,
yes,
where there's power and so on. That adds up to a lot of money over 20 months, as you can easily imagine. Now, this is the problem. I have always believed, as far as this war, others that we won't talk about, that here the quote from General Douglas MacArthur, who is not remembered fondly today, if at all, that there is no substitute for victory, applies. If Ukraine is forced to accept Russian occupation forces on its territory, as has been the case since 2014, then Putin will claim it's a victory. Russian population, which is not well disposed to Ukraine anyway, will support him, and we'll be back at square one in terms of international security, as I stated before. The critical choice for the United States is, therefore, that Ukraine has to win. Ukraine doesn't win, as I said, we will be facing threats to international security on a global basis. But first and foremost, Central and Eastern Europe. Because what has to be understood is that Russia has been at war with the West since 2005. I have the quotes where they say that. And I can give it to anybody who wants it. But the West doesn't seem to understand that it's under attack. And has not been motivated enough to do enough about it. Like provide the weapons or to come up with creative solutions. I'll give you an example. I wrote this a year ago. There's a law that was passed actually by the Senate reaffirming the Lend-Lease provisions of World War II. We lent the British fleet ships, which we weren't using, in order to sustain the Royal Navy in 1940-41. In return, they would concede to us bases in the Atlantic, because we were concerned about the rise of Nazism in Latin America at that point. And in 1941, once the Soviet Union was attacked, we expanded Lend-Lease to include the Soviet Union. And if you go through the figures, and there are historians who have done this, you will see that, first of all, the United States fed the Soviet Union. It provided the meals for the Soviet army for much of the war, and the transportation. Just to give you an example, the Russian word for Jeep is Willis. Willis was the old Jeep company in the United States. So that law's on the books, but Ukraine would be perfectly prepared, I think, to lend us the port of Odessa, which would stop the Russians from attacking U.S. ships, obviously, and in return, get the ships that it needs to break the blockade, which is illegal, as the whole thing is. So that's one criticism. Second criticism, and now it has come to haunt the administration. When there was massive public support, as there was a year and a half ago, for Ukraine, the Biden administration did not go to Congress to get a binding resolution of support. Furthermore, it did not take its case to the country. Now, people my age remember, let's say, Vietnam. Older people would even remember Korea. In both cases, there was no formal declaration of war, and the case was never made to the United States Congress or Senate that in both cases that there should be a war. In Korea, there was a UN General Assembly resolution, which was the formal legal basis for the Allied action there. And in Vietnam, there was the Tonkin Gulf resolution, which it turned out had very dubious antecedents. So as a result, as the war dragged on, public support diminished. The same thing could have been foreseen for Ukraine. We should have done this. Biden didn't do it. He still hasn't done a good enough job in making the case now. And as a result, if you follow public opinion polls, all the figures show declining support right up till today. And this has allowed those Republicans in Congress who want to block aid for whatever reason to do so, because there's no groundswell of public opinion pushing them to do otherwise. So those are two fundamental strategic mistakes by the United States here.
May I just go back to Katerina? If this is what it is, and the best that Ukraine can get is if miraculously this impasse in Congress is resolved, which I hope it is. But that, again, that's not a solution. That doesn't mean, oh, now Ukraine will get what it takes to win. It will simply, we will get more oxygen and we will not asphyxiate. You know, we won't, at least we won't die. All right, that's the best scenario that we can have. And again, with a limited timeline. Of course, the implications of US politics, of course, we're getting into an election year in the US, 2024. God knows what other issues there are, which intermingle, unfortunately, with all this. Domestic problems, Biden's age, Donald Trump, is he going to be the candidate? God knows. I mean, there's so many variables here. We could spend days discussing all this and the implications on American continuing support for Ukraine. But if where we're going, at least by neglect or by default, is an indirect read between the line message to Ukraine, hey guys, can you just find some accommodation? Can you give Putin something and be done with this, please? Because we can't hold the line much longer. And therefore, there is no scenario for victory, as Stephen was saying, which means all the Russians out of every inch of Ukrainian sovereign territory, which would include Crimea, which sort of we forgot about because it was so long ago. It looks like it never happened. So that's the first thing that happened, as you know very well. How does that play in Kiev? I mean, Zelensky says we're going to fight till the end. We want victory, right? That's the official position of the Ukrainian government. No compromise. Victory is complete liberation of all Ukrainian territory, whatever it takes. Realistically, this is an impossibility at the moment, unless something miraculous happens. How do you read all this? Considering the additional obstacles mounting in Washington, and I don't see any improvements if you go across the Atlantic in London or Paris or Berlin or Rome, for that matter, or Madrid. I mean, where's the Portuguese perception of the war in Ukraine? How much has Portugal, supplied to Kiev? I don't think much. So given all this, how do you view the Ukrainian reaction, the government, the private sector, the population at large? You simply have to swallow something bitter and take it, or no, we're not going to do that. We're going to fight to the last man, till anybody is standing, or what is it?
Short answer, I read a lot of polls and sociological research, which was sponsored by British Embassy, IRI. It's mostly benchmark research for 2,000 respondents, and more than 90% in every research of Ukrainians who in Ukraine, they said that complete victory, it's our borders on 1991, so fully victory. Can it be some margin in this research? Maybe, because as you understand, in country where war is, people can, give direct answer which society expect from them. It's very interesting because also in level of trust, we have high level of trust to president, but very low level of trust to parliament and to government, which also tricky because it's one political brand and one political force, which interesting to think. But mostly now, if we go to benchmark research, we see that Ukrainians ready to fight only like till our borders 1991. Why? I can explain to you. Maybe not all people here remember what Russia do in Georgia, in Moldova. So they have pretty the same strategy in every region where they work. First of all, they organize conflict. Firstly, they organize this conflict as like rebellions, which need to liberate like Russian-speaking people. And they usually also give this conflict as like, in some frozen variant, and then refroze this variant every situation when they need. Second tool, which I understand pretty completely and much more better than like military issue, it's political campaigning issue. So Russia originally do this now on these elections on this year in Czech Republic and in Slovakia. So they invest to major informational forces, to TV channels and internet outlets, opinion leaders, and troll campaigns in social media, which form influence to politicians, because every politician cannot to go to popular TV channel. Even if this TV channel pro-Russian and you like popular politician, you anyway go to major, TV channel. And they really good in this propaganda. Now they start do the same in Senegal, in Africa. So they give their political influence still. America and European Union still waiting not to give more. They do a lot of efforts to bring to European Parliament and to local parliaments more pro-Russian people, because people from local parliament then will be elected to European Parliament, and they make more and more influence. So the answer to your question, that if it will be some frozen variant or it will be some, temporary peace, it gives to Russia more opportunities to invest to their hybrid war and their propaganda, which they extremely good in their propaganda. And even now you see new message in Europe that, okay, Putin is very bad, Russia is very bad, but we as people in Czech Republic don't ready to pay for that. So it's their new message. In Africa, they had message that, American is colonist, but Russia and China, it's your business partners. And they respect you as like African nations, and they give weapons, of course, to you as like people who want to go to power with weapons. So it's the main point to all people who do diplomacy and who do decisions, that if we not defeat Russian methods today, it will be much worse. And I'm sure that the hybrid variants then will work in Baltic states. They will work more in China, and I think that United States pay not so much attention to Africa with competitor with China, and to Central Asia, and they really good in that. And last point, it's Russian opposition. We see Russian opposition in Brussels, in Washington, D.C. We don't see so much Russian opposition in Russia. So even the same methods of working in social media and put message to Russian people, for example, to Russian mothers who lose their kids, yeah, to give message how they can live if they, why person in Maryland have house for $700,000 who is a teacher, and person in Omsk haven't bread like and meat if they work as a teacher. So these messages, you know, will work, but Russian opposition don't work in Russia and don't build like really rebellions in Russia. So it's a big problem, and I think it must be solved.
Well, I guess, you know, we should say, but do we ever learn, right? It was Hitler and Mussolini who invented total war and propaganda and infiltration and messaging and what have you. And we seem to believe that with the end of the Soviet Union, this kind of went away, you know, disappeared. That the Russians
Actually, it's Lenin
well,
who invents this, and they learn from him.
okay, well then there's a longer history. You're right. You're right. Yes, he did. So anyway, but the notion where you pointing out, Katerina, is that we're losing the argument because on the one hand, the Europeans, and now it seems like Americans as well, are tired of all this. Oh my God, Ukraine again? I mean, oh, well, I thought we've done that. You know, we're not finished with Ukraine. Can't we just let this thing go? And then the idea is, hey, why should we pay for all this? You know, isn't this their problem or somebody else's problem? Why should it be my problem? And that politically is extremely dangerous when you're dealing with a dictatorship, which, as you pointed out, have no compunction of throwing into the battlefield hundreds of thousands of poor souls. And if they all get massacred, well, get some more. You know, there's still 140 whatever million people in Russia. What do they care if 100,000 are dead or 200,000? These are numbers. You know, these are all coming maybe from the Asian minorities, non-ethnic Russians. You know, what do they care? But so this leaves us, you know, to, unfortunately, Stephen, what you were saying earlier. If we accept this because of our lack of resolve, certainly if you combine the GDP of the United States and Europe to the GDP of Russia, this is, you know, it's say, okay, that determines who wins. Well, boy, there's not exactly, you know, a lot of discussion as to who should win, right? But if the political will is not there, and it seems like it's kind of disappearing. In Europe, it wasn't that strong to begin with, and here we're probably witnessing an unfortunate inflection point. Then the reality is a frozen conflict that you know, will continue maybe to allow Ukraine to hold on to what it has, and that 20% or so of Ukrainian sovereign territory under Russian control. So well, we have an armistice like Korea, you know, and we'll solve this later at another point. We don't concede that this is Russian territory, but hey, you know, well, this is for another negotiation. And in the meantime, as you said, the Russians continue to invest in their propaganda warfare and you know, and convince the Europeans that this is okay and they've got nothing to lose, and maybe, hey, we can start selling you gas again, you know, whatever. How do you see this, Stephen? I mean, is this where we're headed in 2024?
Well, it's entirely possible that we're headed that way. I think it's even more likely if Donald Trump gets elected here. As I said, Russia is at war with the West and has been since 2005. And when the defense minister told military audiences, it's because the reason for it is because we had stopped their efforts to subvert Ukraine in 2004 when there was an election in Ukraine and they tried to ram through their candidate, even to the point of attempting to murder the opposition candidate, Mr. Yushchenko, and failed. And then the election was so blatantly corrupt that it was overturned by popular outrage and demonstrations. So what has to be understood is that this is a multidimensional war. Katrina called it a hybrid war. That's what a lot of analysts call it. I don't like that term, but what term you ascribe to it, all these instruments of power, diplomacy, information, military power, economic power, are all being used by Russia in synchronous fashion, in synchronous or synchronously fashion, to orchestrate a strategic upheaval across the globe to weaken the West and ensure that Russia is a great power that can do as it likes within its sphere of influence. The problem is that Russia's sphere of influence has no boundaries. Catherine the Great said in the 18th century that I have no way to defend my frontiers other than to expand them. That's been the Russian watchword from the beginning. It's an empire. Speaking of Brzezinski, famously wrote that Russia with Ukraine is an empire threatening the security of Europe, not only Europe. I'll give you an example. We're not going to talk about the Israel war, but Russian government has stated that the Middle East is an area on Russia's borders, and therefore Russia has to play a major role in the Middle East. Now, that was the Soviet line. You were all too young to know that. I remember it very well, and probably Paolo remembers it. The problem is that since 1991, the borders have moved back about 1,000 miles. Nevertheless, they still think in terms of Soviet strategic borders. And they think even further because their real objective, and once Foreign Minister Lavrov gave this away, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko said at the 24th Party Congress in 1971 that for the first time, there is no problem in international relations that can be decided without the participation of the Soviet Union. That's what Russia wants. It wants a permanent seat, quote, at the presidium table, as one Russian intellectual said. And therefore, it will disrupt everything in order to get that, because it's not secure unless it's recognized as an empire and a great power. An empire means war. That's what this is all about. Empire and autocracy in Russian history are conjoined at the hip. Russia is an empire. It was an empire. It wants to continue being an empire. That's the rationale for this war, ultimately. And to the extent that you allow autocracy in Russia to flourish, empire will and imperial claims will come with it. They will get up and say that Latvia is harassing Russians, Moldova is, maybe the government of New York City is, because it's a large Russian Jewish community in Brighton Beach, in Brooklyn, near where I grew up. Could say the same about other nations. Georgia, for example, they're saying that Kazakhstan gets these kinds of threats on a regular basis. So what we are dealing with here really is a question: is there going to be an international order of any kind in Europe, and for that matter, the rest of the world, or are we doomed to another cycle of perpetual war on a global scale? That's what's at stake.
Let me ask you something else. And again, this kind of makes it maybe a bit too broad and difficult to predict if we go way into the future. We know that there are certain systemic weaknesses in Russia: population decline, fertility going away, and not insignificant, the loss of human capital that they incurred when they started this business in Ukraine. What is it? I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people left.
Somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000.
That's us, and they happen to be the smart, young, tech-savvy, sophisticated, English-speaking young Russian generation. So they're losing. They lost quite a bit of human capital. I mean, Katrina was mentioning before about the loss of human capital in Ukraine because they're now all in Poland or in Germany or wherever they are as refugees who probably will stay there, indefinitely now. They're making roots. So there's this problem in Russia. Russia's economy has no particular sign of distinction in anything except, the continuing ability to turn out weapons. And clearly our great hammer of sanctions didn't work. I mean, it damaged Russia somewhat, but the notion that Russia would lose its income from selling oil and gas and other strategic minerals and all that didn't happen. I mean, there was some damage, but they continue to sell it. The Indians buy Russian oil, and the Chinese buy Russian
And the
gas.
Europeans.
And the Europe, well, whatever. And we know all these tricks and transshipment, oil, pass from one tanker to another in the high seas. So they still have income, right? to the extent that the world continues to run on oil, and despite whatever happened at COP28, we know that that's going to continue for decades. So that being the case, does Russia have, and by the way, China has its own systemic issues too. I don't think we have time to get into that. It's too much to discuss today. But given all that, in the long term, do they have the winning hand? I mean, what they have is that no, how to say, no breaks environment in which an autocrat can do pretty much whatever he wants. There's no opposition, there's no free media, there's nothing. And so he can try to unfold this design. But do they have the staying power, do you think, considering these dire scenarios of trying to reconstitute some, in one form or another, an old Russian empire, long term, and the strength of their propaganda weakening the West, etc. Are we together, and Europe together, just too weak and too aimless to face this thing? And notwithstanding Russian systemic weaknesses, they still prevail?
Since you quoted Clausewitz, I'm going to quote you Napoleon. He said, in war, the moral is to the material, 3 is to 1. So the material, clearly they're inferior. And they acknowledge that. Yes, that's true. They believe that they are endowed with a superior morale and a superior Christian civilization, and that they will therefore prevail because of this moral corrosion at the heart of the West. Second, the leadership has no choice, because if the leadership were to get up and say we've lost this war and all this, then there might be political undertows from below that could lead to an upheaval. That's been the case in Russian history. Every protracted war puts enormous strains on the system and often leads to revolts, if not successful revolutions. Third, they are constantly hammering home the belief, and Putin did it today because he has his annual talk show today, that the West doesn't have the guts to stay in this thing and that therefore they're going to prevail. And they have this whole ideology about Holy Russia, that it's a true repository of Christian values. I think only 5% of people go to church, by the way. And the head of the church, by the way, is a KGB agent, or now FSB. 2 yachts, among others. So there's a kind of self-hypnosis here, to use George Kennan's term, of this ideological belief. But if you strip away all of that, as far as Putin, and he's the only one we have to worry about here, as far as Putin is concerned, this war must be won. The alternative is unthinkable, because then he's out of power. So his power is going to be at risk. Let me make it more precise. So they have no alternative but victory. And they don't care if the economy is torched, if fertility declines and all that. That's secondary. I mean, they care about it in a political sense. He's gave a lot of speeches over his tenure about trying to do something about this. But that's come second to keeping the regime in power and the greater glory of the Russian Empire. And therefore, this regime cannot survive unless it's an empire. And its survival is predicated on being able to threaten war anywhere it wants by using any and all of the instruments of power across the globe, from the Arctic to Africa. And that's what's at stake. I don't know how to make it any more blunt than that. And what we see in Europe is all these hesitations and obstructions, and here as well, which are not based on any solid argument whatsoever. I mean, whether tactically it's a good idea to tie the issues on the border to the Ukraine and the aid for Ukraine and Israel is a question we're not going to get into today. But the argument against Ukraine has no merit. I have an article that's going to be published soon, coming out, that says so. I just go through all the arguments that advanced by these so-called realists about this, and none of those arguments stand. But if you don't have the will to fight, any argument will serve you.
if I may just resurrect something that was discussed ago, we remember, of course, Kissinger passed away just literally a few days ago, and he was quoted massively in Russia, right, because of his kind of qualified arguments regarding Ukraine and the West and all that. That he said, well, you know, Ukraine in NATO, it's a bad idea. We should, you know, it will not be the Russians, they're paranoid, they will interpret this as a whatever. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, if I recall correctly, he changed his mind, right? Kissinger,
Yes.
after the invasion. And he said, okay, this is a game changer. This was the argument that my cautionary, you know, arguments were valid before anything happened on the ground. But now that it has happened, you know, there's no choice for us than to continue helping Ukraine. Now, of course, Kissinger is gone, and you know, and all that. But given his still authority and prestige, how do you view all this? I mean, some people said it was a horrible mistake. Was it in 2008? Or was it in the Bucharest? I forgot exactly. Summit.
Oh, in Bucharest, to say that NATO would be Ukraine. Yeah.
Yeah, that we would welcome Georgia, I believe it was, and Ukraine, and that this was interpreted by Putin, according to the pro-Putin camp, as some kind of declaration of war. That we were going to bring, you know, I don't know, the 101st Airborne, you know, at the border with Russia, and we were just going one jump away from Moscow and put the stars and stripes on the Kremlin, because this was exactly our goal, right? So this is exactly what the Russians have said. Now, I guess this is neither here nor there because it's academic, but have we played this hand so badly? I mean, in terms of where is Ukraine in the West? I'm talking about before the war. Now, of course, the war supersedes everything because it's a different reality. But is that really such a poor handling of the political, diplomatic, the deterrence, whatever? How do you view all this? I know it's a complicated question.
Well, I was trained as a historian, so you're coming right into my wheelhouse.
Okay, good.
First of all, with regard to Kissinger, as you say, he changed his mind and recognized the last interview that I'm aware of that he was quoted on about Ukraine. I think it's about 4 or 5 months ago. Said that Ukraine had to be affiliated with NATO. Didn't specify membership, but obviously there has to be some connection. Second, I know how the decision was reached in Bucharest, so let me give you some inside baseball here. The Bush administration was supportive of Georgia and Ukraine getting membership. But in late 2007, there were major demonstrations against the Georgian government. And this led Bush to decide that we would not support it at the Bucharest conference, which was NATO summit, which was in April of 2008. Somehow, somewhere along the line, around February, he changed his mind again. And that said, we support this. Now, of course, all these NATO European states were opposed. But you can't have a summit where the president of the United States is opposed and everybody's for, or the president is for, everybody's opposed. So in order to save his face and theirs, they came up with this compromise solution that, you know, which was a disastrous formulation. And of course, the Russians are convinced that NATO is an enemy no matter what. However, NATO is an enemy of Russia only if you believe Russia is at war with NATO to begin with. They do. That's the point. They cannot there's no basis for coexistence, as it was understood back in the day, because they are convinced that NATO is coming to get them, as in 2004 and 2005, when they started telling their own people that they're at war with the West, that the West is at war with them, more important. Furthermore, they were attempting to put together forces to capture Crimea by 2006. They were training special forces, and I published this. It's an article of mine. I can give it to any reference to anybody who wants to see it. In 2006, to take over Crimea, which means they never. The treaties about Europe didn't mean anything to them. And if you read Russian diplomatic statements in the 90s, as well as 2000s, and leading up to the war in Ukraine, starting in 2014, it's clear that Russian diplomats who don't just simply, give speeches, refuse to recognize either the integrity or sovereignty of post-Cold War states in Central and Eastern Europe, and Central Asia for that matter. They would never commit themselves unequivocally, even though government had signed treaties, which it has broken, to go into Ukraine. So I'm one of those people who does not believe that NATO expansion is a threat to Russia. NATO expansion came about at the wish, first of all, of Germany. So an article in Survival, the big magazine on international affairs, from about 1992 or 93 by Manfred Werner, who was the defense minister at that time and then Secretary General of NATO, calling for the enlargement of Europe, of NATO. Every East European government wanted to join NATO. I mean, I know this from personal experience because my own dealings with them when I was teaching at the Army War College in the 90s. They would come to us and say, here's a defense doctrine. We're threatened by the Russians. You have to help us. We want to join NATO. Nah. We had to restrain their enthusiasm in some way. But the fact of the matter is they understood Russia, I think rightly, better than the West does, and still does, and they still do. And NATO demilitarized. You look at NATO's number of men under arms, 1989, right before the fall of the wall in East Germany and the liberation of all of Eastern Europe. And you look at the number of people under arms in 2008, and even in 2013, NATO disarmed to the point of about, I think, 2/3, 3/4. That's not an entity that's threatening anybody. What threatens them is democracy.
Yeah. On that note, I think we're getting very close to the end of our time. Katrina, would like to say some concluding words here. I know we're not, how can I say, we're not resolved any issue, unfortunately, but I hope we have managed to clarify for people here listening to you and to our audience online what is indeed at stake. That at stake is international order, and whether or not we are willing to stop authoritarian regimes that seem to consider force as the normal way of doing things. And by the way, the motif that you pointed out, that we are at war with Russia, the Chinese have been saying this for 25 years in their own internal documents, that we are their problem. But as you said, their problem is democracy. It's not our aggressive intentions. But they have to say, so they justify their claims to being under siege. And of course, Kim Jong-un says that every day South Korea is going to attack North Korea. That's why they need to do what they're doing. So your concluding remarks, and then we can adjourn, please.
Thank you. So, no, first my message is that Soviet Union was huge political and economical machine, and it's failed. So one trigger can change all in Russia, and if they not fear a democracy, they not kill all prospective opposition leaders like Nemtsov, who really have chance to proceed their political forces in Russia. So that's why they stable. They have a lot of resources, like people and weapons, but Soviet Union fail, and it will happen with Russia also in one period of time. Second issue, it's fighting with disinformation. So fighting with disinformation, Russian disinformation, and Russian influence to political processes in Europe, but also in Central Asia and Africa and in the United States we must pay more attention to that, because it's crucial to decision-making process after elections. And third issue, I think that to make more smoothly like political decision for Ukraine, we must give more economical opportunities for Ukraine. Because if you do production with Ukraine, if you trade with Ukraine, you will be fight for Ukraine. So, and now I like explain on my slides that in agriculture, in military sector, it's a lot of opportunities. And if American government will give some warrant insurance or other tools which will be catalyzer for this economical tides, I think it's will move forward also more decisions in Congress about aid, and not only military aid, but also aid to direct budget. And third, thank you all for attention to this term. And if you're interested in more analytics about Ukraine or also do advocacy for Ukraine, we will be happy to share this information with you. And I hope we will talk more about specific issues with your university also. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Stevens. Thank you, Katerina. And thank to all of you who've watched and listened to this. And thanks to my colleagues, to Richard Tracy, the Executive Director of the Global Policy Institute, Jamie, who has been here, manning the ramparts and making sure that we all are on an even keel. So with that, thank you for your attention. In a sense, it's unfortunate that we will have to continue dealing with this subject, but in a sense, it's fortunate if we do, because if we don't, that means we're done, okay? And if we're done, probably we're not done in a good way. And as our guests have amply explained to us, this will be a tragedy, and I hope we don't get to that. But I am not extremely optimistic. Allow me to say that. But I would love to be, proven wrong. Let me put it this way, and that Ukraine continues to fight, and that continues to have the support of Washington, and hopefully of others, whether it's military or, as you correctly pointed out, investments, partnerships, trade. Ukraine continues to make stuff, to sell agricultural products, and let's help them at least to survive economically. And with that, many thanks, and we stand adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.